Thank you, Lade. My name's Geoff Emberling. I'm an archaeologist and museum curator here at the Kelsey Museum on campus, and I've been working in Sudan off and on for the last 20 years, mostly in northern Sudan. My contributions will not really be represented in this particular session, although I may have a question or two that connect deep past and present in that way. But our session today is on deconstructing the war in Sudan, politics and diplomacy, and I might add, based on conversations with the panelists beforehand, we'll also be having some economics, as well as some discussion of refugees. So with that, I think I'll just call up our first speaker, Yousif Hassan, who's assistant professor at the Ford School of Public Policy, and we'll look forward to your talk. Good.
All right, okay, so hi everyone. My name is Yousif Hassan. I'm here at the University of Michigan with the Ford School. I would like to start by, showing my gratitude for the African Studies Center for organizing this conference, for Professor Ladi and for Morwa, Antia and all the staff here, and also for our co-sponsors and organizers, the Weiser Diplomacy Center, Susan Page, she's here, Ambassador Susan Page. Thank you for your efforts, and all, of course, McGill African Studies program as well. So I would like to, begin my talk today, and I will try to keep it as short as possible. I think Professor Khalid Medani, he gave a really comprehensive, overview, and really deep analysis as usual for the conflict in Sudan, and I'm hoping that we can actually get into like more discussions later during the forum, because I think there is a lot of important points that I think we should all come back to. But today, I will try to focus a little bit on the question of political legitimacy, right? And this is the lens through which I'm looking actually at the current conflict in Sudan. But before I begin my talk, I would like to stand in solidarity with the struggle of the Sudanese people, including those who gave their lives, went missing, or suffered because of their unwavering commitment to freedom, peace, and justice in Sudan, as represented by the slogan of the Sudanese Revolution of December 2018. We acknowledge their sacrifice and continue to struggle for their aspiration for a new Sudan that is just, inclusive, and prosperous. So in my talk today, I will attempt to deconstruct the current war in Sudan between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces through the lens of political legitimacy. Competing claims to political authority have undermined the political transition and the democratization process in Sudan during the transitional period that followed the popular uprising of December 2018. And this has resulted in a fractured governance model that deepened the crisis of political stability in post-uprising Sudan. So the main question that I will try to answer today in my talk: what are the factors, historically and contemporary, that contributed to the crisis of political legitimacy during the transitional period in post-uprising Sudan? And my overarching argument, and of course I'll make the case for this argument, is that both the SIF and RSF sought to undermine the efforts of democratization and socioeconomic development in Sudan during the transitional period. And in doing so, they inevitably had to compete over political legitimacy due to the lack of popular support for neither party in the country. So I'm not a political scientist, but I've been, reading, political science literature. So the concept of political legitimacy plays a crucial role in understanding the dynamics of armed conflicts. Political legitimacy refers to the acceptance of a governing authority as rightful and justified, often seen as essential for social order and stability. And when state actors or groups face a crisis of legitimacy, they often resort to coercion to assert control, leading to the widespread conflicts. And these actors often seek to undermine each other's legitimacy through propaganda, control of resources, appealing to popular support, and of course, oppression and violence. So legitimacy can also influence the success of peace negotiations, as conflicting parties often demand recognition or exclusion of rivals based on perceived legitimacy. And the scholarship on political legitimacy in Sudan has focused particularly on the relation between the history of state formation and state building in Sudan, hence the post-colonial state of 1956, internal conflicts, and contested governance models. And some of the key factors that contributed to the crisis of political legitimacy in Sudan include the colonial legacy and state formation. So Sudan post-colonial state and its governance structure failed to align with the ethnic and regional realities, contributing to persistent conflict and weak state legitimacy. So for instance, for example, historically, even the Sudanese armed forces, which is stemmed from the colonial Sudan Defense Forces, which was created by the British Egyptian colonial administration to quell dissent in Sudan, in the Sudan colony, as opposed to protecting the territorial sovereignty of the country. And this involved the oppression and targeting of anti-colonial movements at the time. The colonial powers also deployed tactics such as creating rapid support units along the ethnic lines in different parts of the country to deal with local dissent. And this is very similar to the tactics that we've seen by the Sudanese armed forces with the creation of the Janjaweed and the RSF to quell dissent in Darfur. And also, it's a perfect example for the continuation of this colonial legacy. And before the RSF, actually, there was also another militia called the Marahil, which was formed to quell dissent in the south and Nuba Mountains as well. So both the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF targeted civilians and killed political dissidents in many regions in the country. The second factor is the post-independence politics. So successive regimes, both military and civilian, struggled with legitimacy in Sudan due to the concentration of power within the bourgeois and the political elites, the neglect of marginalized regions like Darfur and South Kordofan, and the failure of national development strategies. Another important factor as well to consider here is the military and paramilitary influence, obviously as demonstrated by the current conflict in Sudan. The reliance on force instead of popular consent delegitimized the Sudanese state over time. And the armed forces have always exerted a bigger role in politics, and more recently with groups like the RSF, led to the militarization of politics, which continued to erode state legitimacy in Sudan. Another important factor, obviously, is the ethnic and sectarian divisions within the country. So ethnic politics, especially in Darfur and South Kordofan, have been crucial in shaping the legitimacy crisis. Various factions mobilize ethnic identities to gain support and often undermining the national identity. And I think the question of national unity or national identity was one of the core questions during the revolution, as Professor Khalid referred to as, national consciousness, right? And I think that was one of the big questions as well, because the Sudanese people and the Sudanese revolution really rejected the identities and the formation of the modern Islamic State that was put forward by Turabi. So I think that's one of the very important factors I think we should really perhaps discuss later. And then, of course, the impact of external actors, which always played an important role in Sudanese politics, and the involvement of external actors, whether through sanctions, because Sudan also suffered from sanctions at different periods of time. Peace negotiations, support of particular factions have always contributed to the crisis of legitimacy by influencing the power dynamics and the recognition of rival groups. And we see that with even some of the, I guess, rebel groups that joined, I guess, the transitional period. So the political elite in Sudan have always relied on foreign actors and foreign intervention to seek political legitimacy in the local political environment in Sudan. So even going back to the history of independence from the British Egyptian rule in Sudan, the call for independence inside the Sudanese parliament at the time was a political stratagem by the Ummah Party, which is one of the major political parties at the time, by leaning to the British regime to undermine the plans of the rival People's Democratic Party to follow through with its platform of unity with Egypt. And both parties were supported and influenced by the two colonial administration. And obviously the Ummah Party was supported by the British, and the People's Democratic Party was supported by Egypt. And more recently, in the current context of the current crisis in Sudan, the current military situation, during the transitional period of a two-army state, because that's, like the situation that we found ourselves in after the revolution, was created during the dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir as a result of competing interests in global politics and international and regional relations. Many of you might already know that the international community, including the European Union, specifically the European Union, played a critical role in the emergence of the RSF as a legitimate actor in Sudan and as a state paramilitary group and part of the state apparatus for border control. And that was done through what was called the Khartoum process, which was a key process established to deal with the issue of African migrants to Europe, and was supported by the European Union and many other Western and regional actors. And the last one that I will touch on is obviously the aftermath of the revolution or the uprising of 2018, because the popular movement of the uprising of December 2018 has fractured the entrenched and deep state institutions of the fanatic Islamist regime of Omar al-Bashir. Obviously didn't completely dismantle the deep state, as Khalid was explaining earlier, but it did create like some fractures within that structure. But the transitional government that followed also faced challenges in gaining legitimacy amidst competing interests from the military and the paramilitary forces, the RSF and the civilian groups. So I would like to argue that the current conflict should actually be situated within the challenges that faced the transition in Sudan. And the transitional period was undermined by a few closely interrelated factors that contributed to the current war. Obviously, the foreign interference by international and regional actors, which I think some of my other colleagues will talk a lot more about it, but it's very important also to look at the results of the war in Yemen, the threat of Iran and nuclear proliferation in the region, and the U.S. and allies and its allies in the region, their desire to basically stop the expansion of Russian influence in the region through, like the agreements in the Red Sea and so forth. Obviously, another factor that undermined the transition was the failure of the economic recovery. And that was because of the rejection of the economic transition plan that was put forward by the Economic Committee of the Popular Movement in the country at the time. Prime Minister Hamdok rejected that plan, and instead he actually relied on new liberal policies that was dictated by international funding agencies like the IMF and World Bank, which always put austerity measures that usually followed by international assistance and loans that, we all know that always leads to the debt trap of underdevelopment. And then, of course, the increased involvement and influence of the army in the political transition supported by foreign actors, right? And the failure of the political elites to capitalize on the gains of the December 2018 uprisings for the benefit of the poor and impoverished people of Sudan. And I think Khalid gave some reasons why the political elites probably failed to actually do that. So this resulted in a lack of national vision for development in the country that prioritizes economic sovereignty, political autonomy, freedom, comprehensive peace, and social justice in Sudan during the transitional period, which were actually the core demands of the popular movement. And this led obviously to the military coup of October 2021. But in recent months, just leading up to the war of April 15, 2023. There have been negotiations to find a pathway to what can be described as a transition to quasi-democracy. And I don't know if we call it perhaps maybe authoritarian upgrade or quasi-democracy. I think, maybe political scientists might have different, nuances in terms of understanding, but it was a form that brings together the army with the RSF generals and factions of the political establishment in the country. Also known as the soft landing approach. And I guess the idea behind that agreement was actually to keep the deep state intact to some degree by ensuring that the generals of the Security Committee of the old regime, Burhan and others, are still in power, and then come up with a power sharing framework agreement that was reached by the two parties and those political elite in Sudan. But one of the key sticking points was actually the integration of the RSF into the Sudanese armed forces and the timelines for this integration process, and who would actually have the final say in how that actually integration process will work. So obviously the RSF wanted longer times, and the army wanted shorter times to integrate these forces together, but the two parties, what I'm trying to argue here is the core issue there was actually a situation about political legitimacy as much as it was about maintaining their business enterprises and economic interest. However, we know from numerous studies that political legitimacy without popular support will always eventually lead into political instability. So in my opinion, the path to peace in Sudan must include the Sudanese civil society and pro-democracy movements. And any discussions or attempts by the international and regional actors to stop the war must include these forces as primary stakeholders in the peace process. They must influence the current agenda and ensure a solution to the root causes of the conflict in the country and to transition to a full civilian democracy that aligns with the popular demands of the people in Sudan. Unfortunately, the current narrative of the war crisis produced by the media and influential international political actors overlooks these key elements that I discussed in my talk. And the narrative of crisis constructs a particular kind of distorted reality that foregrounds regional instability, security issues, ethnic tensions, global terrorism as the main causes for the lack of democracy and development in the region, and particularly in Sudan. And this kind of narrative renders the Sudanese civilian people as incapable of taking their own country forward and frames them as threat to the world stability and legitimizes the intervention or the unjust intervention of regional and international political actors. And by doing so, we end up excluding important local actors such as the revolutionary forces, the pro-democracy movements, and civil society from any meaningful dialogue about any radical long-term solution in the country. So I think I would like to conclude by, I think one of the main objectives I hope that we can actually achieve from the symposium today is like a greater push towards the importance of actually including pro-democracy movement in the current dialogue, which so far has been absent. And I will leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Yousif. I don't know if he's notebook this is, but I'll put it up here.
I think that's.
Oh, is that you? Okay, there you go. Yes, I think we'll take a few questions after each of the talks in the panel, and then hope to have a little bit of time at the end for any broader questions. So, Yousif, will you take a couple of questions?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Anyone like to begin? I do have one question that may take a little bit of creativity to connect specifically to political legitimacy, but this is the role, I mean, we've talked a lot about the RSF, but obviously there are a lot of other militias who are playing a part in the way that this conflict spells out, and I wonder what you think about the existence and the efficacy of those militias, both in terms of how that's going to direct the conflict and how that's going to affect the legitimacy of a final, hoped for peace agreement.
Yeah, no, thank you. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, so that's a very good question. I think my first reaction is we see that throughout the current or the dynamics of the current situation in Sudan, that these other militias or other groups started to actually form a coalition with the SAF, with the Sudanese Armed Forces, right? And I think they do see that. I think probably because they lost also a lot of them. They lost popular support for a lot of the different regions that they were actually claiming to fight for. So, for instance, if you look at obviously within the Sudan Liberation Movement, within within also the Sudan Liberation Army, the North Division, right? A lot of those factions actually lost legitimate political legitimacy during the transitional period, right? And I think one of the ways that they're trying to navigate the situation right now is by forming this kind of alliance with the old regime, right? So.
Okay, all right. It's a complicated dynamic,
Yeah.
But yes, thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering about if you could maybe go back to the point of the economic plan of the committee, and because one of the things about the transition people don't talk about is the economic plan of Hamdok and Badawi. So could you maybe elaborate on the alternative that was there? Because when you speak to them and others, they'll say there was no alternative. But that. And the Sudanese population got that narrative that there was no option but to implement these austerity measures. So I was wondering if you could talk during that time about what people were saying about the alternative to that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think it's definitely the economic plan that was put forward by the Economic Committee, which actually included people from all different kinds of the political spectrum in Sudan, right? One of the narratives that I guess the Hamdok government and also the military, because I think at the time Hamdok was still hopeful in this, what he called it, an ideal partnership, and Sudan is going to actually show the world an example of an ideal partnership between military and civilian people. That was the narrative that he was put forward. It was always portrayed, and there was a lot of discourse, and obviously, they had a lot of influence in the media in terms of portraying, I guess, the economic plan as the radical pro-socialist, and the Communist Party behind it, the left behind it. It's very radical. It's not going to lead to to development in in Sudan. So that was one narrative that was out there, right? Obviously, the other narrative was Hamdok's resume as well. I think that was actually one of the things that was actually was put forward as a selling point for how the plan he's talking about is going to be very successful. Obviously, we all, no, that was actually not really the case. And, and Hamdok was just, he was working for the African Union. He worked in international development agencies, had a long career there. But the fact that he's, putting forward his resume as, as one of the, I guess, as for building the case, for the IMF and, and World Bank to basically, and it's actually very, very interesting because the Sudanese people had to actually subsidize some of the loans. They had to actually raise a lot of money, which at the time, Hemeti said he contributed, I can't remember the figure, to actually repay some of the debt back to the U.S. in order to actually release the next loan. But the alternative was actually calling, it wasn't really as radical, right? I think it was a really well-balanced, economic plan that basically, part of it, obviously, was the reclaiming of some of the state enterprises and companies, right? So, and I think that was actually one of the key sticking points because that economic plan, in my opinion, it was actually very liberal in a lot of sense. But I think the threat of that economic plan was actually the possibility of the dismantling, right, of the military industrial complex that the deep state built over time, and obviously the monopoly that groups like the RSF had over mining, especially gold mining, in the country, and a number of other what used to be national companies and enterprises like the Telecom Authority, for instance, right, that became privatized, but the majority shareholders were actually key figures within the deep state, right? And I think that was really the sticking the sticking point that led to the rejection of that economic plan by by Hamdok, right? So.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks for the good question, Khalid. I think it's time to move to our next speaker, Ambassador Susan Page, as a professor in the Ford School and the Law School, as well as the former and first U.S. Ambassador to South Sudan. So welcome.
Thanks. Can I sit, or do you want me to come forward?
You are welcome. Sit, by all means.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Geoff, and thank you so much also to Lade for co-organizing this with a number of people, including my colleague Yousif and, of course, Dr. Madani and others. It's a pleasure to be here, unfortunately, under such an awful topic, and we've just been watching Sudan kind of go down in flames for a long time, and it does not get the kind of attention that I think it merits given the absolutely deep humanitarian crisis, the displacement, hunger. It's really shocking. But I'm going to talk a little bit, I called my talk Diplomatic Efforts Divided, Understanding Vested Interests in Sudan. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the neighbors, and this is a little bit more current about what's happening right now, and perhaps one of the reasons that it's been so difficult to find not even just a solution, but to find a venue with actual somewhat neutral facilitators. So I'll just say that the most recent peace talks were held in Geneva back in August, and they failed largely because the two sides, even though there really are actually more than two sides, as we've heard, they're allies on the ground through the Juba agreement, but neither of them showed up in Geneva for the peace talks. It's really difficult to make peace when the main belligerents don't attend, even though the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, less really Saudi Arabia, but the U.S. tried to pretend that a lot of other things were happening and they were starting talks. But nonetheless, it didn't go anywhere. So I'm just going to mention, although Dr. Madani talked a little bit about the Sudan's strategic location, the Red Sea coastline, the country's vast resources, obviously agriculture, petroleum. You didn't mention gum arabic, but that's another big one. But also you mentioned the seeds, the sesame seeds. So there are a lot of interests in Sudan, and I'm just going to mention some of the players that have become embroiled in this conflict, which is one of the big reasons why it's becoming impossible to solve. So some of the outliers are the Russian mercenaries that have supplied weapons in the past to the RSF in exchange for resources and access to the gold. I think it was not really clearly stated, but under this corporate strategy of the regime, when President Bashir was still in power, he actually gave, in quotes, Hemeti, who was then in charge of the Janjaweed and then moving into the RSF, he allowed him to have most of the control over the gold mines and that revenue, so that became a major source. And the major exporter of that, or the conduit, is through Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and then to the other Gulf states. So the RSF was involved with Russian mercenaries and did some of that bidding with the gold. Chinese have also, obviously, they played a big role in the petroleum sector prior to South Sudan seceding, but they still are playing a role in what's left of the petroleum sector. But they also have the Belt and Road Initiative, and the government of Sudan had taken loans totaling over $143 million. Then, as has been mentioned, the Gulf states are also pitted against each other, mostly in the hopes of gaining strategic influence. So since 2018, the United Arab Emirates has invested heavily in the Hemeti-led RSF with financial aid, the gold imports to Abu Dhabi, and then to Dubai. But the UAE and has also supported Libya's national army under Khalifa Haftar, which is the unrecognized, so to speak, army by the international community. And that country is we already fear that Sudan could be broken up in similar ways to Libya, which has been a disaster. I'll keep going with those who support the RSF because it is tilted very, very heavily towards support to the Rapid Support Forces. So we have also the RSF also supplied mercenaries to the war in Yemen. So we have a bit of Yemen involved. Then we have closer to home, we have the neighbors. So we have difficulty with having the African Union or IGAD, which had played an instrumental role in previous peace talks, playing a key role because the chairperson of the African Union Commission is Moussa Faki Mahamat, who was the former foreign minister of Chad, and is very close to the Chadian government, which, of course, in N'Djamena is the RSF's main hub. That's where all of the arms go through, and that's where most of the traffic goes through. So Chad stands to benefit either way, even if they stop supporting completely the RSF. They have a natural border right there. They already have an allegiance because of the similar ethnic background of a number of Hemeti's troops as well. Then we have South Sudan. Well, South Sudan mostly brokered the 2020 Juba Accords. So they have another role to play. And as much as Juba has played Sudan and needs Sudan because the pipeline is in Sudan, even though the bulk of the oil is actually in South Sudan. So they also need to pay tariffs, which they tend to pay to the SAF, but they also pay protection money to the RSF. And then we have countries like Ethiopia, which is not at all aligned with Egypt because Ethiopia wants to continue filling its Grand Renaissance Dam. And Egypt has long been opposed to that because that's the Nile waters, and Egypt has long considered, despite a long ago treaty from the 1920s, that really the Nile waters really kind of just belong to Egypt. And so that has been an ongoing conflict, even though the dam has largely been completed and filled, but there's a constant threat by Egypt that they will do something to target that. We then have Kenya. The Sudan Armed Forces were very much opposed when the African Union and the UN tried to put forward the president of Kenya as the sort of main peace broker. And further afield, you have Eritrea, you have, we've already mentioned Ethiopia, so there are a lot of parties involved. The only real states that seem to support, neighboring states that really seem to support the SAF, despite its kind of cover of legitimacy as the official government, the official armed forces of the country, it's really Egypt and to a certain extent Eritrea, but that's again connected to Somalia and the port there to have access. So despite the various initiatives, we have the Neighbors of Sudan initiative, which is led by Egypt. We have US and Saudi Arabia, which have convened peace talks. As Dr. Madani mentioned, the US, I don't quite agree that it has long outsourced its Sudan policy to the Middle East, but certainly since I'd say probably 2017, 2018, as the uprising was beginning, this is a very odd approach because prior to that, it really had been kind of a troika effort, and it was important because the one party that had a lot of weight with the Sudanese government, both pre-Bashir's ouster and after, was actually the United Kingdom. And they also have sort of withdrawn, I think, in part because of disagreements with the US. But Egypt has long had an alliance, of course, historical with Sudan, but they are clearly outnumbered by the number of resource supporters for the RSF. This is causing major problems in terms of resolving the conflict because all of these external actors, they really do not have a reason to settle the crisis when it is benefiting some of their objectives, even if that is regional hegemony or trying to get more power in the region. And they are, because now everyone is going to the Middle East to get that kind of support. Of course, they've bought up a lot of agriculture in Sudan and elsewhere in Africa. But the externalization of the conflict has really allowed the belligerents to not internalize the costs of the war. And that has led to them, both sides, committing awful atrocities. We've already mentioned a number of them, but the SAF is not off the hook, even though We like to pretend, oh, well, they're the good guys. I mean, they're bad. And it's unfortunate, I think, that the U.S. tends to like putting good versus bad and black versus white, and all of them have a lot of blood on their hands, not only from 2018 on, but from the past. So I would just say the last thing I'll add is that in September of 2024, the UN Security Council unanimously adopted UN Security Council 2750, well, really extended it, to continue targeted sanctions against Sudan, which includes asset freezes, travel bans, and an arms embargo. And this particular one lasts until September 12th of 2025. We've seen some sanctions coming out, as usual, from the side of the United States. They tend to do sanctions on both sides simultaneously, and people can see through that pretty clearly, but there hasn't really been a very heavy stance taken. The U.S. Embassy has closed in Sudan. The Special Envoy, Tom Perriello, has not been able to visit. I mean, there are some valid reasons. The SAF actually stopped him from going into Port Sudan, which is now the SAF headquarters. But at the same time, with the security and the situation on the ground, in particular after getting all of our citizens out from the embassy, it's obviously the situation on the ground is horrific. So we're not seeing very much in the way of embargoes or even a push on the UAE to stop their arms supply and to Chad. But that's also in part because we need the UAE for other crises that are happening around the world. So suffice it to say, and I'll stop with all of these points that interconnect, unfortunately, so many different actors in the Sudan sphere, where many countries are hesitant to put too much pressure on Saudi Arabia because, well, we need Saudi Arabia for Israel, and we want Israel and Saudi Arabia to normalize ties. But if people remember when President Biden took office, he said there would never be a way that the U.S. would have relations with Saudi Arabia, and this was a horrible regime. And yet now we are in the process of trying to secure a whole agreement on security and arms sales to Saudi Arabia. So the situation has changed, and that does not bode well for Sudan. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Ambassador Page. I called you Ambassador Susan in an email. It's a very Sudanese. I'm always
Yes, it is.
Dr. Geoff
Completely.
when I'm in the village and whatever.
Actually, the Sudanese always called me Susie.
Susie.
So
Okay. Thanks,
feel
Susie.
free.
Okay, so I think we have time for a question or two.
Yes. Right here, behind. Right here, yeah. Thank you so much for that presentation. I have two questions. One, I wanted to hear you speak a little bit more about the other external supporters of the army. You know, there have been some reports that, for example, Saudi Arabia, Iran, even the Ukraine have been sort of supplying support to the army, presumably in an attempt to kind of undermine you know, access to the Red Sea by some of these other actors involved in supporting the RSF. And then also from a kind of advocacy perspective, what would you say to, say, young people, young Sudanese people in the diaspora who are trying to advocate on the Hill, State Department, et cetera, both in relation to humanitarian aid to kind of localized mutual aid groups, also in relation to migration policy, like, you know, and I think my first question I just want to say, because I feel like Egypt, because it's dealing with this, its own economic crisis, has of course limited ability to support in that way. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, no, that's, thank you very much for the question. I didn't mention as much of this other support, but you're right. The SAF has received support clearly from Egypt, but Egypt is limited. Allegedly, the support from Egypt has been in air supply, helicopter gunships, but they have received assistance from Iran. The Iranian support has mostly been in terms of the drones that they're using. It doesn't seem like it is much more than that, but I don't have access to any of the intel anymore. But that is, I think that the SAF felt somewhat desperate and needed some extra help. And so who are they going to turn to when most of the neighbors are not so much that they don't want to support the SAF, but they can get a lot of money out of supporting the RSF. And I think that it's just a sort of financial calculation. And yet Iran, because, when I lived in Sudan, they were closing everything that had to do with Iran, kicking them out. That was very much, they were really against Iranian support. So, yes, we've seen the articles about Ukraine, and that seems to also be true, but it seems like they were caught kind of just at one of those times and not necessarily that it was their intent to be supporting one side or the other. And then just on the advocacy front, I know that Susan is going to talk a little bit more about that, but I would certainly say it's really essential that they continue to lobby and let their voices be heard, and not have it supplanted by other people's voices. They have done, the communities, what are they called? The resistance committee have been amazing. And it's through them that most of the assistance that is getting through to actual people suffering on the ground has been their network, and through WhatsApp and other messaging, telling people, here are blankets, here's water, here's, this is how much it costs today to get to the border. It's going to take you X number of hours. These are the checkpoints. That's the kind of support we should be providing directly to those resistance committees.
If I could just add to that a little bit, that so archaeology is traditionally a very colonial discipline, and most archaeologists would not be able to participate in a discussion like this, knowing anything about the politics of the country that they're working in, and I admit to some deficits in that area. But as we try to work in a more colonial way, we're working much more closely with local communities.
Anti-colonial way?
And yes, a much less colonial way, a decolonial and anti-colonial way. Thank you. So we have connections with communities, and we've been able to continue to get money to those local communities, and it has, because of the nature of the funding we have, it has to be in the guise of continued work on cultural heritage, continued work on education, rather than on blankets and food and that kind of thing. But it's pay for people, and so I think that this is there are many ways that money can trickle in, none of them adequate, but anyway, we do what we can. Okay, I think we need to move on to our next speaker, and if you have further questions for Ambassador Page, please hold them until the end. Our next speaker is Suliman Baldo, who is the Executive Director of the Sudan Transparency and Policy Tracker. So, do you want to speak from there or here?
Either way, I'll go to the
You'll go, yeah.
Sorry, I'll speak for 3 minutes, Khalid. So if you can somehow project the map of Sudan, and to make things easier to explain.
Did I say I'm working in a more
Yes, you know this one.
Exactly.
I knew what you meant.
Okay, please consider what I am going to say as a next layer of depth in what Khalid presented this morning in the keynote speech. And I don't think he didn't get sufficient time to explain all what's happening there. I'll talk to the issue of the intersecting geostrategic and economic interests of external powers as they link to the interests, political and geostrategic and economic interests of the warring parties. And in this, I will also detail some of what Ambassador Page has mentioned. And of course, the question of legitimacy is in the heart of these discussions, because both the Rapid Support Forces and Sudan Armed Forces are not to be considered with any level of legitimacy, because they are one and the same part of the military security establishment carried over from the Bashir era. The Rapid Support Forces is the current integration or iteration, the current incarnation of the Janjaweed who were formed by the Sudan military security forces to fight insurgencies in Darfur. In 2013, they were given more of a regular force nature by creating this new body of a paramilitary force, directly armed, trained, equipped by the Sudan Armed Forces as its counterinsurgency force to fight rural insurgencies, and as a policing force, political police force, to suppress urban pro-democratic protest. So this is one and the same force, and this force has been rewarded by the regime of Omar al-Bashir by awarding large economic concessions, both to the Sudan Armed Forces in the guise of having them control and operate independently from the regime and from the government. About 200 economic enterprises registered as private companies. These are state-owned enterprises capitalized by public money from the treasury, but operated solely by the Sudan Armed Forces. And the same concession was given to the Rapid Support Forces, except that the Rapid Support Forces formed a conglomerate of privately owned companies registered to the commanders of the Rapid Support Forces. So in using their political security leverage in the state, the Rapid Support Forces were also at the same time expanding their wealth, expanding their empire. Since they were one and the same, the security committee that protected the regime of Omar al-Bashir for over 30 years, when Bashir fell in April of 2019, this structure of kleptocracy, of privatizing, the assets and the natural resources and the public revenue of the state for the inner ruling circle, the ruling party, the Islamist movement, and for the security agencies that protect them, this system didn't fall with the fall of Bashir. It survived the fall of the Bashir during the civilian-led transition, which had a very short life from 2019 to 2021. And together, the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces were there to suppress the protest by the revolutionaries who were described by my colleagues, who were demanding, correcting, the trajectory of the transition and ensuring that there is a genuine transition to democracy. It was the army, it was the Rapid Support Forces, the Central Police and National Intelligence Security Services that fired on unarmed protesters during the entire transitional period. And when economic policies by the civilian cabinet started threatening the very foundations of the wealth of the army and the Rapid Support Forces and institutions, and this is what you mentioned, Yousif, these policies were the main trigger for the coup d'etat of 1921. The lifting of subsidies, the unification of the rate of exchange of the Sudanese pound to the dollar, the creation of a single treasury account where all revenue of the state should go to one account all of this would have overnight deprived the companies of the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces from all the power they had in controlling and privatizing public revenue and the assets of the state and the natural resources of the state. That's why together they staged the coup of October 2021 to protect their economic interest. In October 2021, the army RSF staged that coup, removed the civilians, and since then we have a junta governing the country. During the Bashir era and during the transition, Rapid Support Forces and the army had their own autonomous diplomacy apart from the, that of the civilian cabinet. And therefore, they were, in direct relationship, bilateral relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. Why? Because as of 2016, both the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces were lending mercenary services for the international coalition led by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates in the war in Yemen. Except that the actual fighting was done by the Rapid Support Forces in the southern front of Yemen. And the Sudanese army was deployed on the border. And this explains the lack of, any fighting experience or capability of Sudan Armed Forces, because all the fighting within Sudan or in these mercenary wars was done by the Rapid Support Forces. As we speak, there are soldiers from Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces today in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as part of that deployment. And Saudi Arabia is keeping them there. They don't want them to come back and join the warring parties because, of course, we know they want to war against each other in April of 2023. Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates paid millions in dinars, riyals, dollars, both to the Rapid Support Forces and the army as institutions. And these payments, this huge revenue was kept off the Central Bank of Sudan and the control of Ministry of Finance, even during the civilian transition of 2019-2021. And therefore, these two have very huge economic and financial interest. The army, for example, controls, entire sectors of the national economy. And a serious competition between the army and Rapid Support Forces occurred in multiple sectors of the economy. The banking sector, for instance, the gold sector, the livestock sector. As part of that competition was a growing, alarm and a growing distrust of the Sudan Armed Forces, of the rapid expansions of the wealth of the commanders, Abdurrahim Dagalu, the second in command, Hemeti, who is the first commander of the Rapid Support Forces. The entire command is dominated by members of the clan of Hemeti, and they all were, look at it. The war room of the Rapid Support Forces is also the corporate board of the private businesses of the family. And therefore, the army was seeing more competition in the livestock sectors. Abattoirs that the army has, which are the largest in the country, were paralleled by one that Hemeti was setting up, to gain more foothold in the livestock sector. And it's not only in the goat sector, which has received a lot of attention. Now, this is why we should see the war that is going on in Sudan not primarily as between two generals or two forces. It's a war of a security military establishments against the democratic aspirations of the people of Sudan. This is a war against the people. The two security forces have the same mindset, the same training of attacking unarmed civilians. And that's why we see the RSF are engaging in this massive ethnic cleansing campaigns, killing of civilians on the ground. But at the same time, which is receiving less coverage, Sudan Armed Forces are daily bombing markets, not only in Darfur, the stronghold of, or what they call the social incubator, of the Rapid Support Forces. This is the area where Rapid Support Forces recruit their force. Therefore, the army can collectively punish people from Western Sudan, and they are sending the Air Force bombing markets in Darfur, but also in areas controlled by the Rapid Support Forces, even within the capital, within Sudan. And that's an essential part, this urban, aerial strikes against civilian markets is, an essential part of the civilian, of the urban violence of the nature of this war. Now, the diplomacy of the Rapid Support Forces and the army extended to Russia. As they were allied under Umar al-Bashir, and when the Russians, Bashir went in 2017, met with Putin and said, come protect us from the plans of the US to, spread democracy in our region, and Putin sent Wagner Group. And this is one and the same establishment, and therefore, there was, a dimension of the Wagner Group, of course, which is really very similar to, Rapid Support Forces, in that it's structured like, an autonomous security, this is a private security company. This is a militia that has economic activities such as Wagner as well, and both function as a mafia. Therefore, there was a sort of an initial and continuing, sort of, easier way for the RSF to benefit more from Wagner Group than the Sudan Armed Forces. They received urban warfare training from the Wagner Group. They received training on piloting of drones from the Wagner Group, and the army was saying, these instructors of Wagner Group are not good in training us, and therefore we leave them to you, Rapid Support Forces, because they are one and the same, And that explains again the efficiency in urban warfare of the Rapid Support Forces, because they were better trained and they had better, exposure to combat in Yemen. And therefore, today, as we speak, Russia is back to Sudan. But, because it had this ménage à trois between the Rapid Support Forces and the army, they are having, links both to the Rapid Support Forces and to the army. Rapid Support Forces through Haftar and through their, the Africa Corps, the Wagner Group, iteration of today in Central Africa Republic. And at the same time, official Russia is providing weapons. Russia doesn't give gifts of any kind, so Sudan is paying, the authorities in Port Sudan, the Sudan Armed Forces, are paying Russia in shipments of gold. The Wagner Group company that was set up in Sudan, Marawi Gold, incorporated in Sudan, but working on extraction and processing of gold tailings and so on, is still until today one of the largest producers and exporters of gold directly to Russia. Official Russia is therefore supporting the army out of Port Sudan because of this link, but at the same time, there is a lot of transnational smuggling coming from southern Libya, from a militia allied with General Haftar into Rapid Support Forces area. Subul al-Salam, the name of that militia. It's an extremist group operating in the area of Kufra in southern Libya. Now, Egypt, of course, would, basically on the side of the Sudan Armed Forces, as Ambassador Page has explained, through its belief, that this is a national institution and it is a guarantor of the integrity of the state, and that Sudan should not be allowed as, as a state to collapse, basically, because this would, cause a lot of upheaval and destabilization in the entire region. Less known are the economic interests of Egypt that are between companies that are owned by the Egyptian army and the Sudan army companies. For instance, in Ramadan of last year, the Sudan army, one of its holding companies, is called Al-Ittihadat Al-Mutaaddida, was shipping 20,000 cars from Djibouti to Egyptian ports to help keep them, the price of meat low. This was in July of 2024, in full war of Sudan. Sudanese army companies were feeding the consumers in Egypt to keep the prices low so that Sisi regime remains, basically stable and not facing any protest because of the cost of living. And therefore, the relationship between the Sudanese army and the Egyptian army is in essence where the economic interests are directly linked, and any disturbance or disruption of this could cause major political unrest and destabilization in Egypt. Now, if you look at the dynamics of the war economy, the Ittijahat, which means multiple directions, this company, which is under the Sudan Armed Forces, is exporting livestock from Sudan through the northern border directly to Egypt, and buying livestock from the from Somalia and from Uganda and so on, and shipping them from Djibouti to Egypt. So the 20,000 that were sent in July were just part of other thousands of cars that were going monthly out of contract between these Egyptian companies controlled by the Egyptian army and the Rapid Support Forces. Now, if you look at the war economy, the production area for livestock is areas that are held by the Rapid Support Forces today. And the exportation of livestock is out of Port Sudan, therefore in areas that are controlled by the South. The war hadn't stopped the exchange of economic benefits between the army and the Rapid Support Forces. There are entire shipments of, basically, sheep and cows leaving Western Sudan, going into Sudan army areas, because the Rapid Support Forces has devised a way of generating income from this trade movement by, levying illegal taxes and extorting money from the trucks that are carrying this livestock and moving into army areas. And the army, is happy to receive these shipments because this is, one of the main sources of revenue for the Sudan Armed Forces. Iran, of course, Sudan, when it went to war against, the Houthis, Bashir severed the relationship with Iran overnight. Iran has helped Sudan develop one of the largest weapon manufacturing capacities in Africa. Sudan is the third largest producer of weapons, which are all copies of Iranian, Chinese, and Soviet-era medium and small range weapons, and some armored vehicles and tanks and so on. And there were hundreds of Iranian technicians in Sudan when Bashir severed the relationships overnight. So the relationships were really very bad for many years, since 2016, but under the conditions of the war, as you mentioned, Iran, saw an opportunity. The army is desperate, went for them, renewed diplomatic relations, and they are in receipt, of Iranian support in the area of drones as well. Iran, like Russia, does not in the business of giving free weapons, and therefore this is again paid for by gold produced in Sudan. My last comment is very current, and it's an anecdote. When Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu went to the United Nations, he showed two maps, one of the cursed and one of the blessed. The cursed ones are Syria, Iraq, Iran. They are all, put in one block in black. The blessed ones are Sudan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. What does link Sudan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia? It's the Abraham Accords, because Saudi Arabia has yet to sign to the Abraham Accords together with Sudan. And Sudan, for the last period of the transition, we had a dichotomy in the diplomacy because the civilian government was dragging its feet in signing the Abraham Accords, despite that, the fact that during the earlier Trump administration, Secretary of State Pompeo went to Khartoum and said, we will lift U.S. comprehensive economic and financial sanctions against Sudan if you sign the Abraham Accords. what the civilian government did was to sign on a commitment of, or the intention of signing to the Abraham Accord, and this unblocked the lifting of sanctions. Trump is back in the White House, and this would be the priority number one in the new administration, for resolving the crisis in Sudan, which is part of the Middle East, Near East policy, that will be devised by the new Africa team and the new Near East policies in the State Department, National Security Council, and so on. And the interest of democratization and justice and freedom that the revolutionaries were shouting for during the 2018 uprising, I'm afraid will be secondary to the geopolitics of the area and the fact that there are other considerations and priorities with regard to the Middle East and the Horn of Africa, Red Sea areas. So I would leave it here, and if there are any follow-up questions, we can stay. Thank you.
Thank you, Suliman, for those comments. I think in the interest of time, we're going to go right on to our last speaker, and then we'll take any remaining time for further questions and discussion. So I'd like to invite Susan Clark, who's a psychotherapist working with underserved populations in Fort Worth, Texas, and also I see author of a new book.
Correct.
So, please, welcome.
Do you have my slides then? Please get them up. Is this the clicker?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you have to point.
Which way do I have to point? That way?
Yeah.
Bring this back to the beginning, please. There you go.
Yeah.
Thank you. Women Caught in the Crossfire. It's actually available back there. You can get it after we talk. The author is in Juba right now working very hard for peace. She asked her daughter and I to bring her message. So actually today we're talking about political structures, diplomacy, stakeholders, seeking peace at the highest levels. Actually, I'm coming here to introduce something else into the conversation, which is peace at the lowest level. These great swaths of common, unarmed women and children, millions, who, in comparison to this handful of elites and negotiators and politicians and warlords, constitute the largest cohort, the biggest stakeholder throughout the regions of Sudan. So let's look at the reality of this. I want to see it through the eyes of one Dinka woman, through the eyes of millions, actually. So we can contemplate the 5 kinds of peace that she learned throughout her lifetime. Her life encloses the first civil war, the second civil war, and all that has followed. Her first memory is as a child, 3 years old or 4 years old, being carried by her brother, running from an attack of the government forces against her village. Her brother was shot out from under her. The people around her, her mother grabbed her, dragged her through the blood-soaked grass to safety. That's her first memory. And that memory has caused flashbacks throughout her life. She is a woman of basic education. In fact, her education ended with her wedding. Here's her wedding picture. And a forced marriage, which swept her up into the second civil war. Her husband was deeply involved as one of the leaders in the SPLM. This brought her, he brought her to Khartoum, then he took her around throughout Egypt, then to Addis, then to Etang refugee camp where she spent most of her time, ultimately to Nairobi. He would visit from time to time. She gave birth twice more in exile. But he ultimately abandoned her to the sprawling refugee camp in Etang, Ethiopia, geometrically overpopulated. In a region, a camp regularly flooded by powerful seasonal rains. It is amazing that she and her children and anyone from that camp, in fact, survived. But it is from her day-by-day experience of survival and of empowerment that so much of her understanding and all of our understanding regarding peace has emerged. And in her experience, 5 kinds of peace have become known. And two of those types of pieces hold promise, but only one of those has the power to fulfill its promise. So let's start. The first kind of peace she learned in the camp was the peace of silence. That's the peace at the marriage level, when a man and a wife have pretty much given up on each other, but they still have to live together. The peace of silence can last for decades. Then the second piece, there's the peace of attrition, where both sides run out of ammunition, they run out of guns, they run out of young men, and they stop fighting just because of that. That peace lasts only until one or both sides can rearm, can reload. There's a third kind of peace. We're very familiar with this. This is the peace of conquest and defeat. She also saw this. And I would call this peace the peace of the graveyard. The graveyard is a very peaceful place, very peaceful, but it does not support life. The fourth kind of peace is the negotiated peace. This is a piece of a contractual, agreed-to peace, negotiated at the highest level. This peace has promise, but it's a peace of absence. Absence of conflict, absence of war. It is a space of great potential. Into that space, either good or evil, well, actually both will rush in to fill the space. The fifth kind of peace is the peace of the heart, the peace of the community. This is not a peace of mutually assured destruction. This is a peace of mutually assured salvation, mutually assured survival, mutually assured development, self-sufficiency. This is the kind of peace she learned in the camp, and that she and the other women with her now are bringing to South Sudan. So let me move on. Now, her understanding began actually in a very small way. It was a cooking circle of 5 women among the 10,000s in the camp, and they used to talk to each other about the war. Let me just quote here. One is saying to the other, I'm talking about all of Sudan. We have a bad habit in Sudan. Somebody says, oh, I don't like this situation, and right away someone gets a gun and starts shooting. So nobody says, let's sit down, let's talk together. Nobody says, what is the solution? We do. We women sit down. We talk. We are their wives. Yeah, but who listens to you? It started in the cooking circle. That's where peace in the eye of the storm for her was born. And it was very successful, but as she goes on to say, I do not mean to say that there was enough food. No. I do not mean to fool you into thinking that we didn't wake up a little weaker, a little thinner every day. All I mean to tell you is we put our little strengths and hearts together, and when added up, they equal the strength and the heart of one healthy woman. During that time when we worked together, not one person, man, woman, or child in our circle of families died. So this grew. More women began to unite and organize in the camp. This was the practice area, the rehearsal place. The older women made traditional cures. They traded modern medicines. They sold the oil and rice and beans from the UN. They traded in Gambela and brought it back to the camp. A cadre of women of diverse tribes rose up together to manage the census and food distribution in Tilon 5, a segment of 2,000 families. Let me describe that to you. Eventually, we got a prize for Tilon 5. The UN staff said they had never seen a camp so clean as ours. We had strong and fair leadership. Nuer, Dinka, Equatorial, and others, women from every tribe. Mary organized our section that way with a hidden purpose, to make sure leading women from diverse tribes would have to work as one to survive. History moves on. After the Peace Accord of 2005, the referendum 2011, there was hope for stability, at least in South Sudan. But again, fighting brother against brother, grudge against grudge, broke out, and women and children were cut down in the streets. A quote, "The fighting we heard that night was the start of a new brother-on-brother war between Riek Machar and Salva Kiir. They had been tasked to form a new government together, but their top skill, perfected over so many years, was only to fight and to make war." This is a problem. Actually, there are two kinds of mindsets, two kinds of skill sets. The one mindset, the one skill set is the war mindset, the war skill set. Unfortunately, the men of that generation have developed this mindset and this skill set for decades, and it is strong. But there's always been another mindset. There's always been another skill set. It's always been there, but now it's developing and growing and spreading more. This is the peace mindset. This is the peace, the community building skill set. And at this point in Sudan, actually, this mindset and this skill set is largely among the women. So, women from all backgrounds united and stood up to stop the madness. This is history. I'm reading you this so that, as history, so that you know that this is not a dream. This has happened and is still happening. The call went out by phone, by publication, by word of mouth to women from all groups, all tribes, all towns and cities, leaders from the highest to the most basic levels of responsibility, to women of all languages in Sudan to speak with one voice. The original 50 of us came together in Juba to envision what would happen next. I will name these pioneer women so that their actions will not be forgotten in history, as often happens to the heroic deeds of the unnamed, as the proverb said. Until the lion learns to write, every story will glorify the hunter. So in their first meeting, what they did is they decided to go all 50 of us together to each department of government. This is a model for how things can be done. One office at a time, the officials were shocked that such a huge troop of women would come to their office. The Minister of the Interior, the Office of the Vice President, the Ministry of Cabinet Affairs, Chief of Security, the President's Chief of Staff. We also went area by area around Juba City to speak to the chiefs and to the women there. We chose Gudeli as the place where everyone would meet. People from all walks of life in South Sudan, Dinka, Nuer, Equatorian, Kakwa, Madi, Taposa, Mundari, Shuluk, Jurchol, many other tribes and languages, all gathered together, brought together by the women under one sun that day in Juba. And a book, the author of this book, stood up to speak. Women and men of South Sudan unite. Tribalism has no value. We must stop fearing each other. We must stop hating each other. Unity is love. Unity is forgiveness. Forgiveness is peace. And now you want to ask me, we're talking about international, global war. It is so great and big and overwhelming. Why should we talk about such a fragile thing as love and forgiveness? Love is as weak as water. It's okay. Is water weak? Look at the Grand Canyon, a mile deep of rock cut by water. Look at the floods over the last months in Spain, in the US. Is water weak? Ask the 200,000 who were swept away by the tsunami. Water is powerful, but water can be held in our hand, even to drink and to quench our thirst. Water is both. Love is both. They went on. They sent word out to the 64 chiefs, male chiefs, diverse tribes of South Sudan. They called upon the chief of all chiefs. He encouraged the 64 to come. They called for a great meeting in Freedom Hall in Juba. We women labored without sleeping with one purpose and heart, so the work moved the way small rivers flow into a river. Waters, no matter where they come from, in rivulets or rapids, all flow in one direction, toward the sea. Our love, which is perhaps what is missing in all of this discussion. Our love for our beautiful land flows this way. The men brought together. They spent 2 days blaming each other. It was a terrible meeting, but somehow the women held sway and they held each man accountable for his words. And out of that came a resolution. They agreed to a national peace dialogue. They agreed to spread this word to the grassroots militia carrying out killings all over South Sudan. The resolution was signed, brought to the president, Salva Kiir. He formed the National Peace Dialogue May of 2018 and took full credit. To this day, Muslim, Christian, traditional women from all tribes continue to gather each other together to build, to heal, to inspire, to organize, to love, and to live for peace. In the marketplace, we're talking about the lowest level now, the broadest level. In local manufacturing, in women-led gatherings and organizations. Look at this list. This is just a few of the youth-led and women-led organizations now working. Listen, a building, a big building, the foundation of it is below the sideline. You don't see it. It's built of rough materials, tough materials. It's not as pretty as the building. But a great house is going to stand or collapse based on that rough foundation. Abok's daughter, Sarah, will be speaking to you about her youth-led and women-led group. She'll explain it to you, that is hoping for the next generation to bring forth a much better future. So let me just finish with this, and I quote, "I am working alongside thousands of other women in South Sudan." And this is her life, one woman's story, from death to life, right? Working now for peace and development in South Sudan, and this could be repeated in North Sudan if we care to. From dying camps to living organizations. We're working along thousands of other women in South Sudan and throughout all the places where war has scattered us. We are working together to heal our country's heart, to bring harvest to desolated land, to teach trade and peace side by side. But while we are building, others are still tearing down. It is to the unfortunate ones who know only to tear down that we offer this message. We are women. Our work has always stretched beyond the limits of sunrise and sunset. Do not think us weak, because we do not fight by killing. We fight by giving birth to life. We fight by feeding the young from our own bodies. We raise up new life from our own ashes. For this, one must be stronger than death. We are such women. We are not victims. We are proud bearers of the wisdom of generation. We are every country's lifeline of hope for the future. Hear us then and learn from us, and let us love you, and let us bring you back to peace. We have the mindset, we have the skill set for peace at the broadest level. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for that very moving and important intervention. Lade, I'm not sure where we are on schedule. I think we're theoretically supposed to be done within 5 minutes or so. But okay, so we'll take a little extra time for questions, and maybe shall we start with some of the ones that have accumulated online? Okay.
There is a question online, and it says, the question is from Eamon, and it's how we could link the U.S. interest with resolving Sudan conflict, or how could we link U.S. interest with resolving Sudan conflict as U.S. intervene unless having benefits? I think maybe they meant to say, could the U.S. intervene without having anything to benefit from it?
Okay, any of you panelists like to take that?
Yeah. I guess maybe the question is, how do we align the the U.S. interest with those of the desires of the, at least like the popular movement in Sudan? Can they even be aligned?
Well, I'll take a shot. I don't think that it is a problem for aligning. It's a problem of follow-through and commitment, because I think the population has been very clear for a very long time, and what they want is for the military to get out of politics. Full stop. And the interest, generally speaking, of governments, but I'll speak about my government, the U.S. tends to like working with governments. And it is very, they don't understand what that means to work with groups and organizations that are not in some sort of formal body politic, because that's just squishy and unpredictable. And so oftentimes, even when political parties are a one-person briefcase, well, that's a party, they've been registered, that has the formal legitimacy, even if it doesn't actually have any real legitimacy. So, I mean, I think this goes back to the question earlier about advocacy, and I think it's really important for those groups and these women's groups and other grassroots. I mean, countries all over the world have a history of securing peace at the most local level because they have to live together. It's the outsiders that don't know what those things are, and then the elite who have no interest in that, because when you have chaos, you have an easier way of staying in power. So I don't think it's a problem with aligning, but whether or not we would, or any government for that matter, would go so far as to back off from support of the formal structure of government. Geoff's looking like...
Well, I mean, there's just it's obvious looking at the U.S. response to Ukraine and Gaza and Sudan that there's a difference among those three in the level of U.S. engagement and the level of perceived U.S. interests in Sudan.
Yeah, I think, no, that's true. But at the same time, all of this is essentially support to governments. And so, even the humanitarian assistance, okay, to a certain extent, it's going through UN bodies to then go to the government or through official channels that can distribute the aid, the food or whatever it is. I think it's just much harder when it's, again, sort of amorphous groups. It's not that it hasn't been done and can't be done. It can be. But it's it's just harder for.
That's a significant roadblock for actual U.S. engagement.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
the U.S. has gone a long way away from supporting direct organizations. You know, the aid infrastructure is now so big that its money goes to big NGOs. So in the old days in South Sudan, Southern Sudan, when it was still united, there was a lot of direct assistance to churches, to mosques, to, you know, where they were doing the work on the ground. But once the aid industry really got so built up, those organizations have to fend for themselves now. So you have people sleeping in churches and mosques and, you know, any structure to take refuge, and the, you know, whatever religion, the priests, the, you know, imams, they don't have the resources anymore.
Okay, Lottie, were there more online you wanted to read, or shall we go? I see Howard's got his hand up. You do? Okay. Of your
Yeah.
own.
Thank you to the panelists. My question is about the African Union, and I think maybe Ambassador Sudan Page can answer this. I remember that when the African Union was established, or when the OAU transitioned to becoming African Union in 2002, there was the idea that there would be an African standby force to intervene during crisis. I am not sure there is any standby force at this moment, but at the same time, the African Union places emphasis on resolving conflict among its member states, and Sudan's conflict is one of those. I wonder whether, to play the devil's advocate, whether it could be said that the reason why the Sudan crisis has not been resolved is because the African Union is overwhelmed. There is conflict in the Congo, in Chad, in basically the Sahel region and several other regions across the continent. So I'm just making the argument for them, not that I believe in this. So I wonder if any of you could respond to the failure of the AU.
Yeah, just very briefly, I mean, I think a big part of it is that the AU has lost a lot of credibility, and like all regional organizations or intergovernmental organizations, the structure is such that they can't really take decisions without all of the member states voicing their assent. And that means Sudan's at the table, or whatever the country is that you are trying to resolve. The same thing happened with Burundi several years ago. The same thing has happened with Sudan, with South Sudan, with Somalia, so it's very difficult, even when you have the African Union commissioners or the Peace and Security Commission gathering everyone, they agree, we're going to send something. One party, usually the party most involved, objects. And the same is true. Look at the UN Security Council. I mean, all of these mechanisms really are based on a buy-in to the structure and kind of everyone's goodwill. There's not the same kind of mechanism to enforce those agreements. But also, at this point, I mean, all of these countries have vested interests one way or the other. It makes it really difficult.
Thank you very much for all of the questions. I wanted to maybe refine the question that, not refine, but piggyback on the question from the chat in terms of both you, Suliman, and Ambassador, you talked about the strategic and economic interests, both of the local actors and the regional actors. So the question is, are there any kind of interest for peace in the region? I mean, whether it be destabilization of all of these actors. From your experience, at what point do we go from a war economy that actually feeds into these disparate different interests to a situation in which actors regionally and the United States perhaps may find the situation needing resolution? I mean, what William Zartman, I don't know if you know him, yeah, of course, that ripe for resolution. When is it ripe for resolution? That's one question. A related one, Ambassador, is also about the issue of the U.S. policy vis-a-vis the Horn and Sudan, is that I agree that there was an interest on Sudan during the peace agreement with South Sudan and that period, but there's also domestic coalitions that played such an important role. And so when I say it's subcontracted, I don't mean that sometimes overrides domestic coalitions and what they're interested in. And so in this particular situation, I know we as these Americans work with different groups, and there's a great deal of interest in the conflict. So do you think there is a role for domestic coalitions in the United States that may impact? I understand the executive branch handles foreign policy more than anything else, but is there that kind of opening or potential opening?
Let you start maybe with the Chad piece.
Well, we hope so that these domestic constituencies will have leverage and put pressure so that the crisis and this catastrophe at all levels that's happening in Sudan is contained and a resolution is found, not only by a ceasefire, but some foundation of some lasting peace, according to what people want, which is one that leads to restoration of the democratic path of governance. I'm saying this because I see that the situation as it's playing out, and I try to hint to this, would prioritize, the primary conflict in Gaza, the war between Hamas and Israel and the Palestinian situation, is going to be the leading factor in the new administration's policy towards Sudan, and that they will subcontract, and I'm using the same word, the resolution to its allies. The new administration will subcontract Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar in this order, and then Egypt to sit down, address the situation, resolve it. We want a ceasefire. But this ceasefire with humanitarian access and resolving the humanitarian catastrophe would be, really a sort of stabilization of a situation, if we are not careful, would lead to a de facto partition of the country. Because as we speak now, there is a de facto partition in terms of territorial control by the warring parties. Rapid support forces in Western Sudan, Jazeera, and most of the capital, and the Sudan armed forces in Eastern Sudan, and the rest of Northern State, River Nile, and Blue Nile State, and White Nile State, and so on. So if the issue is getting the generals to finalize the agreement on the accords, Abraham Accords in the situation of in the Near East, then there would be no impetus in the effort led by the U.S. to resolve the root causes of the conflict and address in them in such a way that these endless cycles of force stops. From U.S. perspective also, the role of the Islamists is increasingly being understood. And it's raising alarm in intelligence community circles because they see this as a direct threat, of course, to U.S. security interest, national security interest, and therefore the resolution or the determination of the U.S. policy would be more in the hands of the intelligence community than the diplomats of the State Department, who are more keen on considerations of democratization, human rights, building capacity of civic groups and all of these values. But then if the interest is, counter international war on terror, then all these things would be put to the, in a secondary consideration. I don't know whether you agree with me on this or.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few different considerations. To your first question, does the region have an interest in peace? I think, I'll just say for myself, I'm not sure I understand deeply enough all of the different interests and all of the financial ties. I've been out of that kind of depth for a long enough time that I mean, I have a broad sense, but some of the organizations that work on accountability and the financing, where it's going, that would be helpful to try to actually really dig deep into what are the motivations beyond us, kind of, well, they want a new order in the region, or they want a port in, so I think that's one thing. But if you understand all of the different interests, you can then start figuring out how do we address that, whoever the we is, but, how are all of these interests sort of addressed? In terms of the U.S., I think the new administration, I don't know, because the Biden administration has, I think that they went so much more militaristic in their approach generally. Some of this, of course, is longstanding from the War on Terror, but they didn't really pivot. And the opportunity to have appointed an ambassador at the moment when they lifted sanctions, that was the original impetus, and it was delayed. And then even when Biden came into office, further delayed. That was just a missed opportunity. And to me, what it says is that people like us, I mean, the diplomats, really weren't as important as what he came to office saying, that, we're going to listen to the diplomats, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think that there could be a very good connection with Saudi Arabia if it's played the right way, let's say with the new administration, because Saudi Arabia has real leverage right now with Israel. We are not going to normalize relations unless there's something done for Gaza. And if you could then tie that to and Sudan, that would be, I think, something that we could put some real pressure on, or that actors in that space could put some pressure on the parties to, all right, you've got to have this included. We would then want this other aspect included, and that could be a real push. Oh, sorry, domestic coalitions. Yes, I mean, you're right. During the peace talks, leading up to the rejuvenated peace talks in 2002, which I was part of, that led to the CPA in 2005, there was enormous interest and pressure from, yes, it was largely church groups, but students, and it was much more organized than kind of the Save Darfur, which was, obviously later. And it's like people are, I don't know, it's really fallen off. I think people are so disillusioned by what happened in South Sudan that it's sort of like, our fingers have been burned. This was never going to work. It was never a state that should have been a state, et cetera. And I think, but that could be, people are still doing work. They're still trying to work on, books like this. Those are the things that give us hope. And we know that people are working on the ground. So absolutely, I think it can happen. It is happening, but could be built larger.
Okay, we've reached 12 o'clock. Thank you all for your participation, and join me in, sorry, a final comment from Susan.
Just practical. Just practical. Oh, just practical. Look, you pick up this book today, you get a 30% discount. Just for doing it right here. We don't want to take any with these home. Thanks.
Okay, and so now join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you all.
Thank you, Geoff, and thanks everyone. Please, let's put our hands together for our panelists once more.